Welcome to TradeSense, where Windward brings together the brightest minds in global trade, maritime, and AI to break down the biggest developments shaping our industry. I'm Hila Sasson, Director of Product Marketing here at Windward, and in each short episode, we go beyond the buzzwords to deliver real insights that matter. Today, we're diving into contract risk and compliance in the never-ending sanction cycle in the maritime industry. I have here today Daniel Martin, partner at HFW. Hi, Daniel. Thank you for joining us. How are you?
I'm very well, thank you. Yeah, thank you for having me.
I'm very excited to dive into such a practical issue for most of our customers and stakeholders in the industry. Let's dig into it. In 2025, when stakeholders review a charter party or sales contract, what's the very first thing they should examine in the sanctions clause or make sure they have it? Also, what do you think is the minimum language that must be there before they go any further with the deal?
Really good questions, because I think where we've got to is that sanctions clauses are now pretty standard across the industry. And you're right, the question is looking at the clause and making sure that it works. So from my perspective, I'd say there are two specific things you need to think about. One is, when is the clause going to bite? And secondly, what are the consequences? So with the first aspect, what I really mean is which sanctions regulations are applicable, what are the circumstances in which the clause is going to operate, is there mere risk of sanctions enough, or do we need an actual sanctions breach? And then in terms of the second aspect, really what we're thinking about are what remedies should be available to the innocent party. Is it about suspending performance, or do they need to terminate the contract, or something else? So for me, those are the two key aspects.
Interesting. And I assume it's very different than what our stakeholders were used to a few years ago, when sanctions clause was basically, are you on the sanctions list or not?
I think that's right. And as the sanctions have got more complicated, the clauses have had to be more complicated as well, because parties clearly want to be able to rely on the clause in a wider range of circumstances.
For sure. So it's not just the existence of it, is the actual meaning of the clause and what it actually covers. I want to keep talking about future-proofing our contracts and our stakeholders' processes. As we said, sanctions lists change every month. Currently, advisories are published even more frequently than that. And I really want for us to try and come up with some practical tools or wording that our stakeholders and audience can keep in a 6 or 12-month charter compliant contract without rewriting the entire agreement mid-voyage in case something happens. And as we know, something always happens in our industry.
I think those are really good questions. And I think if you put yourself in the shoes of the person who's sitting down to draft the clause, clearly there are two different things happening. You know what the risks are today, but you also need to guard against the future risks in the event of a change. So really, I think it's a combination of being very specific and targeted to the present risks, but also including enough general and wide language that will apply in the event of a future change in the regulations. So that sort of combination between very specific and very general is, of course, a difficult balance to strike, but you need to think about the expansiveness of the clause. And sometimes what's helpful in trying to be expansive about the clause is thinking about the parties' respective rights and obligations. So who has to do what? And the sanctions clause is going to affect that, because you want to ensure that parties responsible for performance takes into account the sanctions landscape as is at the time that they come to perform.
For sure. We've also seen with the latest OFAC advisory that the width of responsible stakeholders was very expanded in a matter of just one advisory, and there might be mid-voyages on their way when this happens. So future-proofing is key, but regulators will still want some evidence and not just showing that the contract's kind of tried to cover everything. I want us to tackle that a little bit. We know that the regulators expect real proof. We've seen it in all the latest advisories that came out. And stakeholders should try to avoid bad actors to their best ability, which is very vague, as they always say. And we know that deceptive shipping practices are very wide. They're very hard to detect, such as GNSS manipulation, multiple ship-to-ship chains. So what evidence can a contract hold or require so stakeholders know that they have how to prove that they did the best to their ability, and to audit trail it, of course, following the deal?
I think these are difficult issues, aren't they? Because really what we're talking about is still doing the due diligence in advance, because you need to understand who your counterparty is. But you're right, what you're then relying upon is the contract almost as a safety net to protect you in the event that actually you have a suspicion that, notwithstanding the DD you did on onboarding, you have a concern about your counterparty. So regulators, as you say, will want to see that there's a contract framework in place, but clearly your contract rights and obligations will only extend to your immediate counterparty. So I think the sorts of things that you're thinking about in terms of how can you keep your counterparty honest, which is essentially what we're talking about, is things around obligations on them to provide you with documents, obligations on them to provide you with information if you make requests. And you're right to say that you want audit rights, because ultimately you may find yourself in a position where 6, 12 months after the voyage, you need to go back and unpick things and understand what was going on. Sometimes we see parties imposing on their counterparty an obligation to follow their own compliance framework. So you may be happy to share your compliance protocol and ask the other side to sign up to it. But ultimately what we're talking about is a right to ask questions and to suspend performance if you're not happy with the answers. But exactly as you say, once you've identified those high-risk activities, whether it's GNS manipulation, multiple STSs, or other high-risk activities, you can include specific warranties around not engaging in those practices, but also providing information and evidence to demonstrate that that was the case.
For sure. So it's a combination of both the behavioral screening, let's say, and the list screening, and also having enough assets and attestations and documents in place that you have been verified in advance to make sure that you're covered. If we sum it up.
Exactly. But people, I guess, need to be aware it's a bit of a double-edged sword, because if you have all of these rights and then you choose not to exercise them and a problem develops later, a regulator might say, well, you had all of these contractual rights, why didn't you exercise them? So there's a bit of a balance there as well.
For sure. It's a very delicate balance between being compliant and adjusting to the regulators, but also keeping your business going and growing in such a sensitive ecosystem. In all of our conversation, we talked a lot about stakeholders, and I know that recently a lot of new stakeholders came into place and into the spotlight with regulators, for example, equipment providers. We know that these new stakeholders don't have any due diligence process in place, and their knowledge about what is a deceptive shipping practice or what they should be aware of is very new, is very narrow. What additional things can you recommend to these new stakeholders that were introduced into this domain do or should have in mind when they write up contracts now?
I think that's an interesting issue, isn't it? Because what we're seeing is the scope and the depth and the remit and the sanctions increasing and impacting on more and more people. I think some things are common across all different sectors. It doesn't really matter who you are, counterparty checking, doing the due diligence. But I think if we think about equipment providers in particular, there are sort of additional issues that they might have to think about. So they may be thinking about where and how the equipment's being used. So do they need to track vessels to understand when their equipment is ending up? If they're providers of digital services, are they looking to identify IP addresses and log the locations where services are accessed? Equally, we've seen issues where people are providing data services or IT services, and they need to roll out updates, and questions need to be asked about where software is being downloaded, because that too would be a supply in breach of some regulations. So I guess what we'd be saying is that the person needs to think about the specific nature of the activities they're engaging in and identify the sanctions risks that apply to them. And as you've said, ultimately it's a question of doing a risk assessment and then managing that risk. But I think equally thinking about suspension and termination rights is really important, but also thinking about how you would exercise those rights.
Having a good way to end things in case something comes up is not less important than how to start a deal in today's environment, for sure. Before we finish, one last thing, let's give the viewers a concrete fix they can apply starting tomorrow morning to their contracts.
This is always the tricky thing, isn't it? I've got one magic wand to wave. What's the one thing I would do? And clearly this is a complicated issue, lots of things to think about. I think ultimately, and this is really the point that I think you just finished with, which is that it's about thinking about how you'll manage a situation if things go wrong. And therefore, if I was saying to people to do one thing, I think understanding the full scope of sanctions clauses they have in contracts. So doing that review today to understand the language you have in place, the circumstances in which you might be engaged, and the remedies you have. because I think having that visibility now, rather than having to scrabble around and look in annexes and appendices to documents, means that you're in a better position to react quickly if something changes. So that visibility of what you already have in place, I think, would be the first thing I would be doing.
Thank you, Daniel. I think it was a great tip that our audience will benefit from. So that's it for today's episode of TradeSense. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you so much, Daniel, for your time and valuable insights. It was great to unpack how contract risk evolves and should develop from now on, given the ecosystem we're all operating in.
Thank you from my side as well. It's always a pleasure to talk to you, Hila, so thank you.
If you found this episode informative and useful, please share this video and follow us on YouTube. Stay tuned. We have a lot more episodes coming up.